are back to talk about Initiative 1631, a measure that would impose a carbon pollution fee. Speaking for the measure is former State Representative Brady Walkinshaw. Against, Dana Bieber, spokeswoman for No on Initiative 1631. You know the drill here, Brady. What is this initiative? Why do we need it?
Totally. Well, thanks for having me. Great to be here. Thanks to Seattle Channel. Thanks to everyone who's here. I was really excited by the invitation to get to talk about this. So what we're here to talk about is Initiative 1631, which would put a fee on the state's largest polluters to raise about $1 billion to invest those resources in future generations in our state in clean energy and natural resources. And what that does, I mean, for me personally, I grew up in Washington State. On one side of my family immigrated here from Cuba. We're going to talk about how this impacts immigrant communities in our state. The other side of my family's fifth generation Washingtonian has been working on conservation in Washington State for 5 generations. And what we have in front of us right now is an opportunity to take what the state legislature passed in 2008. So in 2008, the state legislature passed carbon emissions targets, which said that we need to reduce emissions in Washington State by 25% below 1990 levels by 2035. And it may not come as a surprise to you that we are well behind that pathway. And to get on that pathway, an initiative like this is a sensible approach built by the broadest coalition in state history: health advocates, small business, children's advocates, small businesses, again, more small businesses actually, environmentalists, broad coalition that's brought this to the ballot. This is a really exciting measure in Washington State. It's a chance for us to invest in clean energy jobs. It's a chance for us in Washington State to invest in the health and well-being of future generations. And ultimately, and this is what it comes down to, this we're going to talk about tonight, is ultimately it comes down to being able to hold the largest polluters in this country, which, by the way, my colleague here, who I met and I quite like, but my colleague who I just met earns tens of thousands of dollars representing major oil companies from Texas, $25 million into the state on this campaign from the opposition, big oil. And that is going against the health of future generations and conservation in Washington State. So that's what this initiative's about, and I can't wait to talk about it. So thanks for having me.
Dana Bieber, you represent industry. What's so bad about reducing carbon emissions?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate City Club, and Brady, thank you for being here too, and to have this important conversation with voters. So the trouble with 1631 and why our coalition of over 154,000 Washington families and farmers and consumers and small businesses have come together to urge a no vote, it's because it's a misleading and ineffective and costly proposal. And let me explain what I mean by that. You know, 1631, the proponents say they're going to go after the largest polluters in the state of Washington. But what they don't tell you is they actually exempted 8 out of the 12 largest carbon emitters in the state, get a special exemption, and won't have to pay the fees and tax under 1631. So then who does pay the cost? That gets pushed down to Washington families and small businesses and consumers in the form of higher prices for our basic necessities. Cost of gasoline would increase. The cost of utilities would increase. The Washington Policy Center took a look at this and said the average Washington family in the first year alone would pay an additional $300 a year in increased costs. And it's important to note this is a permanent escalating tax that would go up each and every year. So you can see how hundreds of dollars a year for families could quickly turn into thousands of dollars a year. And what do we get for this? That's one of the fundamental flaws. We don't know. 1631 is so poorly written that we don't know what we get. We don't know how this money will be spent. And instead, it's spent by an unelected board of political appointees who can spend the money in pretty much any way they want. And there's no assurances written into 1631, or a requirement even, that the carbon emissions would be reduced. And that's why we believe it's a bad policy, and we're urging a no vote.
So from the top, why were those large polluters left out? I think people need to know that.
So you're going to hear 3 disingenuous arguments here. The first disingenuous argument you're going to hear is that this passes on a fee to consumers in this state. If big oil companies that are backing this initiative could pass that fee on to consumers in this state, which, by the way, has not happened with other forms of fees on fuel emissions in this country. If they were to be able to do that, they wouldn't be spending $25 million in this initiative. So that's the first thing. You're not going to see the degree of fees that are being spoken about by my colleague here passed on to consumers. The second disingenuous argument that's being made and being spread actually by the campaign is this idea of accountability. And that's wrong for a couple reasons. The way the initiative works is that it's raising $1 billion through a $15 per metric ton price on carbon. And those fees are being the revenue, that $1 billion generated by that, it's going to be governed by a 15-member board of scientists, of policymakers, of health and business advocates. Unfortunately, not big oil. But it will be governed by that board. They will propose how those funds are going to be spent, and that'll go to the state legislature for authorization. So it's accountable directly to the elected officials, like Senator Carlisle, who was just here, accountable right to the elected officials who are actually designing and developing the use of those funds. So that's the second thing. The third thing that's disingenuous about this argument is exemptions. And this goes to your question, Joni. What's disingenuous about the exemptions argument? Sorry, I had to just unpack it a little bit. What's disingenuous about the exemptions argument, because it's so important. What's disingenuous about the exemptions argument is that it basically says that the argument that the companies that are being exempted here are groups like TransAlta, which is actually it's actually a good example. It's actually a coal producer in the state that is being worked on actually through legislative authorization to work to transitioning off coal and actually on to hopefully solar farming in the state, which is right where we should be going. So the exemptions that are worked into the initiative are actually ones where we're trying to work with companies that are either competing on global markets, right? Competing on global markets where we don't want to cut jobs, or it's where we're actually working to create a clean energy future. So the exemptions are actually pro-job, pro-clean energy.
I'm simply stating the facts. And the facts are that 8 out of the 12 largest polluters in the state are exempt from 1631. But of course, small businesses and families are not. And that's one of the troubling aspects about it. That's one of the reasons, people like Dr. Cliff Mass from the University of Washington, who's absolutely passionate about finding a solution for climate change, is urging a no vote on this measure because he doesn't believe it's effective. The other thing I want to talk about are the costs. It is absolutely wishful thinking to say you're going to increase taxes by $2.3 billion and there'll simply be no cost to consumers, because that's certainly not what the governor said. Governor Jay Inslee admitted, yeah, the cost of gasoline is going to go up about 13 cents a gallon.
I really want to be clear here that when we're done talking, I suppose, are gas prices going to go up, and how are poor folks, communities of color, going to be able to absorb those gas increases?
Do you want to go to that first?
I'll start with it. Independent studies have said that the cost of gasoline will increase by about 14 cents a gallon the first year alone. And remember, this goes up each and every year. There is also additional cost for utilities. This week, Puget Sound Energy issued a statement and said, in fact, yes, ratepayers need to know that the cost of your utilities will go up. These are regressive taxes. These most impact those who can at least afford to pay more for basic necessities. We all need to drive to work. We all need to heat our homes. We all need to cook our food. Those are the costs that would go up each and every year. And it starts out at $2.3 billion in the first 5 years. But because this escalates, in 15 years, this will be a $30 billion energy tax.
So I'm just going to say for the record, I don't agree with those figures that you've put out. But what I will say is the number that has been discussed is that what this would look, it will impact, there will be an impact. And I think the campaign has talked about a figure of about $10 a month per household in Washington state. So that's kind of the figure that we're talking about. But if you then look at the $1 billion that's being generated in revenue, a lot of those resources are actually going to help with tax relief to some of the households who have least in this state. So let's talk about the uses of those. Can I talk about the uses of those funds?
Sure.
Or do you want to?
Yeah.
So just to talk about the uses of those funds, because my colleague here brought up the term regressive. And I just want to reflect on that for a sec. What's regressive is when we don't meet the Paris Climate Accords. What's regressive in this country, and in the state, we'll get to the state, what's regressive in this country is when we fail to transition this country at the speed to clean energy opportunities for jobs. And what's regressive in this country is when brown and black kids in this country have asthma rates at multiples times higher than white kids. And what we're seeing in this, with this initiative is investments that are coming out of the 70% of that billion is going to be invested back into working on clean energy production and opportunities in Washington state. Investment back into things like forest health so that we are able to invest in the forest management practices that are going to avert the fact that what also is aggressive, by the way, is air pollution. What's aggressive about air pollution being created by cities like Yakima in the state saw 48 days where air quality levels hit dangerous standards. And this initiative is going to invest back into the forest management practices through groups like the Department of Natural Resources in this state, who are going to be able to manage our forests in ways that we actually bring down those air quality pollution. And it's hard to talk about this without mentioning the orca whales, because we have to talk about our orcas. And the reality is that we have been polluting the Puget Sound. And if we do not look at restoring salmon populations that are actually going to be feeding the orcas in this state, we are also going to be able to use funds from this $1 billion to invest in pollution prevention programs. So the impacts of not raising that money actually directly are regressive for the health impacts of kids and families in this state.
You know, the troubling thing about this measure, in addition to the cost increases for families and farmers and small businesses, is that we don't know what we get. This measure is so poorly written, it doesn't have a specific spending plan. It's like the measure is written such that it says, well, just give us the money, we'll figure out how to spend it, trust us. There's no specified spending plan, and there's actually no requirement that despite spending all this money, that carbon emissions would actually have to be reduced. And in fact, they incentivize themselves for failure, because if the 15-member board isn't successful at reducing carbon emissions, and it will be a challenge to do when you exempt 8 out of the 12 largest polluters, you know what they get? More money. That's reasons why the Washington State Farm Bureau, for example, is urging a no vote. They represent 45,000 farmers in the state of Washington. Most of these are small family farmers. They care about climate change and climate policy. It's important to our state, and yet groups like that are urging a no vote because it doesn't have the accountability and requirements for success that we as voters deserve.
Yeah, I think you're being a little confused with numbers here.
No, I think
this is actually going to be covering 80% of emissions in Washington state. So 80% of total emissions of companies producing 80% of emissions are covered under this initiative. So the other point I just want to bring up, kind of along those lines, is the reality that as we look at where the resources from this are going, the resources from this are accountable. I mean, what you see here is a governing board that's modeled on very similar things like the Workforce Development Board that we have in Washington state, which is very similarly restructured. You have 15 members appointed by elected public officials who propose spending plans that then go to the legislature for authorization. This isn't rocket science. I mean, it's a pretty consistent and tested way of raising and then using public funds.
This is actually doesn't have the accountability. These are political appointees on this board, and they don't have the legislative oversight that other boards may have. They are appointed by the governor, and they can spend the money however they choose. In fact, there's no checks and balances, and there's not the conflicts of interest, the protections that there should be. This member board can actually funnel the money to their own communities, to their own pet project, to their own organizations. And that's what we're talking about. That's why our former state auditor, Democrat Brian Sontag, is urging a no vote on 1631, because he says it lacks accountability to voters.
I hear Essex Porter coming in here.
Yeah, a question first about the exemptions. Brady, I think a lot of people don't understand why the coal plant is being exempt. It's going to stop using coal in 5 years. But what about the other companies? Why do they get an exemption?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the main driver behind the other exemptions that have been agreed upon and written into this initiative, it's a set of companies that are competing on global markets that for very specific reasons either have plans to move toward clean energy futures, or for specific reasons, it makes sense based on global markets for those decisions to be made. So that's the framing I would say about the 8-12. But the data point I would come back to, ESSEX, is this covers 80% of emissions in this state. So it's covering the vast majority of emissions. It's covering 100 of the state's largest polluters. And it's raising $1 billion from those 100 largest polluters in this state on a $15 per metric ton tax on or fee on carbon. And that's where those resources are being raised. And I worry with this initiative a bit that in this discussion, you kind of have this conversation about some of these details, for instance, about exemptions, for instance. The reality is that by pushing forward this step, where the vast majority of major polluters, who are oil companies and specific utilities that haven't fully transitioned onto clean energy, are paying a fee, and that fee is being reinvested in communities.
ESSEX, may I get in there real quick and just make one quick point about that? The proponents like to say 80% is covered, but they've never backed that up. And in fact, when the Seattle Times took a look at this, they recently reported that it appears to be less than 60%. So that's according to the Seattle Times, and it makes sense when you exempt 8 out of the 12 largest polluters. And it's not just that, it's possibly hundreds of other large corporate polluters that get exempt, but then small businesses and Washington families don't.
I gotta go to the Twitterverse, Natalie.
I think we're still waiting for Twitter questions to come in, but I have a question, and this is for you, Brady. We know that Canada imposed a carbon fee several years ago, but an article by the Vancouver Sun said British Columbia's carbon emissions have fallen by only 2% since 2007, under expectations. So is there a guarantee that that won't happen here? How are we measuring impact?
So the pushback on that, the comment I would make there, Natalie, is that is in the face of Canadian emissions going up 15 to 20%. So you saw British Columbia actually reducing its emissions, even if it was just in that figure, against Canada writ large seeing a significant increase in their emissions. So the positive outcomes of that actually were significant emissions reductions, especially based on what you saw across the rest of Canada.
I have an audience question. Hi, how you doing?
Hi, thank you. So this summer with all the wildfire smoke, I've got 2 young kids, and I had to interrupt my work to take them home from a summer camp that was outside because I was worried about their health. And so health for children is a really important thing to me, and thinking about how to decide on a policy that's going to impact them so much. I want to know more about which side really to trust. This is a complicated issue. And so I was hoping that you could both tell me a little bit more about who are your main proponents and donors.
Thank you. I'd be happy to answer the question. I understand your question and your concern as a mother. I have 3 children myself, and so I know what you're facing. And I think as a parent, I think we can all agree it's our responsibility to preserve and protect our environment. And that is where 1631 is uniquely frustrating, because it doesn't do what the proponents claim it's going to do. And it kind of goes back to Natalie's question there. There's nothing in 1631 that will actually give a guarantee or even an assurance that despite spending billions upon billions of dollars, that carbon emissions would be reduced. So to the second part of your question, though, you asked about who's part of our coalition. We represent over 154,000 Washington families and small businesses. It's organizations like the Washington Farm Bureau, the King and Pierce County Farm Bureau, the Washington Retail Association. Labor unions are urging a no vote. You know, the iron workers, the laborers, the building trades. Labor unions have joined with business coalitions, farmers from across the state, all urging a no vote, because we believe that this is an ineffective and costly measure.
I think she also asked who are the major funders of your initiative.
The funders shouldn't be any surprise. I know the proponents like to bring it up quite a bit. It shouldn't be any surprise that energy companies are supporting our coalition.
Like
because
who?
after you exempt the other large all the other large polluters, and you leave energy companies and their customers on the hook to pay the additional costs. It shouldn't be any surprise. But you know, Washington voters are smart, and when they talk about money, they talk about the money that measures like this would cost them. It's undeniable that the increased costs of gasoline, electricity, natural gas will all be paid by Washington families and consumers. So when we talk about money, I think that's the critical issue to voters.
So,
Audience.
I don't feel like you answered the question about the main donors, though. Could you be more specific?
I'd be happy to. And the nice thing about Washington State is all the donors are public knowledge on the public disclosure website. So you can go there and you can find out exactly every dollar that comes in and every dollar that comes out.
Yeah.
They are the large energy companies like BP, which is based out of Whatcom County. It's the other energy companies that employ tens of thousands of people in the state of Washington and contribute to our local economy. And again, they were the ones who didn't get the special exemption that the other companies got.
Can I answer that question too? Or you can go ahead.
No, you go.
Okay.
You go. It's like a four-way stop in Seattle. Go for it.
To your question, I think this is the crux of it. I mean, for decades, you've seen major oil companies trying to make policy that would arguably prevent pollution. And the reality is we're seeing this happen again in Washington State, just with a different flavor. And what you're seeing is the most expensive, the largest investment ever in Washington State ballot initiative history, going into trying to prevent what is an appropriate, modest, and acceptable price on carbon, driven by the broadest coalition campaign in our history. So children's advocates who are looking out for the health of kids, a vast number of labor unions.
But speaking of the history, there was a carbon measure on the Washington State ballot a couple years ago, and it failed. So why is this one any better or any different?
So that, just to shift to that question, so what we've seen here is what happened in 2016 in this state. It was an important effort to bring a lot of voters out to educate people on the importance of voting around carbon. And I saw so many people out in neighborhoods knocking on behalf of that initiative. This builds on that, and it builds on a lot of other coalition building efforts that's happened in the state. And I would actually say that 2018, going into this year, we've actually experienced some of the worst wildfire seasons we've ever seen. We've actually experienced and lived through some of the biggest impacts of climate change that we've seen in our own lives in Washington State. So I think you see an urgency of this moment. I think you see some lessons, and I think you see the broadest coalition we've had.
A question about who ends up paying. You know, as consumers, we see the price of gasoline going up and down on a whim. We have no clue why it goes up and down. So why would the companies that produce gasoline have to pass the entire cost of the fee on to the consumers? They raise and lower the price of gas on a whim anyway.
Well, you know, when you talk about increasing the cost by $2.3 billion in the first 5 years alone, it's wishful thinking to think that companies are going to just absorb that cost.
But they could.
Those costs get pushed down to consumers in the form of higher prices for gasoline. I mean, the governor has also admitted that the price will increase. Puget Sound Energy just this week said, yes, in fact, the cost of utilities will increase. And this acts like a regressive energy tax that puts the burden on those who can least afford to pay more.
So
and quickly for Brady, if I might, for Brady,
good.
You talked about all kinds of programs that would somehow assist low-income people. Do low-income people actually get any kind of cash rebate from this?
There's not a cash rebate. What you see in this is you do see relief. So there are programs that help with efficiency standards for low-income communities. So
you might get your house insulated, but you're not going to get some cash that help you pay for the gasoline that's now more expensive.
There's tax relief, but there's not a direct cash payment. So if you look at where
how do people experience that relief? And
it's coming through a variety of programs that are supporting kind of low-income communities and communities of color in the state.
But that's not the kind of thing that supports a worker who has to drive 50 miles round trip to a job site. That they have to pay the increased costs in gasoline. That's one of the reasons that you're going to find many labor unions urging a no vote because of the cost and the regressive nature of this.
So we got to go. So much more to say. We have been discussing the Carbon Initiative 1631 with Brady Walkinshaw and Dana Bieber. Civic Cocktail will be back next month. Thanks so much for watching.